You think you know Norse mythology because you've watched Thor movies or seen Disney's interpretations of ancient stories, but I'm about to shatter everything you believe about these so-called family-friendly tales. What I'm going to reveal in this four-part series will disturb you, shock you, and completely change how you view the mythology that's been sanitized for modern audiences. Today, we're diving into the Norse myths that are so dark, so twisted, and so graphically violent that Disney would never touch them with a 10-foot pole. My name is Sarah, and I've spent the last 5 years studying comparative mythology, specifically focusing on how ancient stories have been transformed for modern consumption. What started as academic curiosity became an obsession when I discovered just how far removed our popular culture versions are from the original myths. The Disneyfied versions we know today are essentially fairy tales compared to the brutal realities of what our ancestors actually believed and told around their fires. Let me start with a question that will haunt you by the end of this series. When you think of Loki, what comes to mind? Tom Hiddleston's charming anti-hero? A misunderstood trickster with daddy issues? Maybe a reformed villain seeking redemption? Well, prepare to have that image completely destroyed, because the real Loki from Norse mythology underwent a punishment so horrific, so viscerally disturbing, that it makes Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. But before we dive into that nightmare, let me explain how I stumbled upon this dark rabbit hole. It was 3 years ago, during my graduate studies in comparative literature, when my professor assigned us to research the original sources of popular mythology adaptations. I chose Norse mythology because I was a huge Marvel fan and thought it would be fun and familiar territory. I could not have been more wrong. The first red flag came when I started reading the Prose Edda, one of the primary sources for Norse mythology compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. The stories I found bore almost no resemblance to anything I'd seen in popular media. These weren't tales of heroic gods saving the day with thunder hammers and magic tricks. These were stories of betrayal, graphic violence, psychological torture, and moral ambiguity that would make modern horror writers take notes. The more I dug into authentic Norse sources, the more I realized that what we call Norse mythology in popular culture is actually a heavily sanitized, Disneyfied version that removes virtually all the elements that made these stories meaningful to the original cultures that told them. We've taken stories that were meant to explore the darkest aspects of human nature, the inevitability of fate, and the brutal realities of existence, and turned them into superhero adventures and family-friendly entertainment. This transformation isn't accidental. It's the result of centuries of cultural filtering, Christian influence, and modern media's need to create content that can be consumed by the widest possible audience. But in doing so, we've lost something essential about these stories. We've lost their power, their genuine emotional impact, and most importantly, we've lost the hard truths they were meant to convey about life, death, loyalty, and the consequences of our actions. Disney, in particular, has mastered the art of taking dark source material and transforming it into uplifting entertainment. Look at The Little Mermaid, where Hans Christian Andersen's original story ends with the mermaid dying and dissolving into sea foam, transformed into Disney's version where she gets her prince and lives happily ever after. Or consider Sleeping Beauty, where the original versions include rape, unwed pregnancy, and cannibalism, all sanitized away for Disney's romantic fairy tale. But Norse mythology presents a unique challenge even for Disney's sanitization machine. These stories are so fundamentally dark, so rooted in concepts of unavoidable doom and brutal justice, that they resist easy transformation into family-friendly content. This is especially true for the story I'm going to tell you over the next 4 parts, a story so disturbing that it's never been fully adapted into any mainstream media, despite Loki being one of the most popular mythological characters in modern entertainment. The story I'm talking about is The Punishment of Loki, and it contains elements that are so graphic and psychologically traumatic that even telling it in its authentic form requires serious content warnings. We're talking about forced fratricide, eternal torture, and imagery so visceral that it was clearly designed to serve as the ultimate cautionary tale about the consequences of betrayal. What makes this story particularly fascinating from a cultural perspective is that it reveals something essential about how the Norse viewed justice, loyalty, and the natural order of things. This wasn't just a random tale of violence. It was a carefully constructed narrative that reflected their deepest beliefs about honor, consequences, and the price of disrupting the cosmic balance. But here's what's really interesting, and this is where my research took an unexpected turn. The more I studied this story and compared it to other Norse myths, the more I realized that Loki's punishment isn't just dark by modern standards. It's arguably the darkest, most disturbing story in the entire Norse mythological corpus. And that's saying something, because Norse mythology is filled with stories that would give Stephen King nightmares. To understand why Loki's punishment is so particularly horrific, you have to understand the context. Loki isn't just any trickster god. He's a figure who exists in a complex relationship with the other gods, sometimes helping them, sometimes hindering them, but always operating according to his own mysterious agenda. He's married, he has children, he's integrated into the social fabric of Asgard despite his chaotic nature. This makes what happens to him all the more shocking, because it's not just the punishment of an enemy, it's the systematic destruction of a family member by his own community. The gods don't just punish Loki, they orchestrate a scenario that forces him to witness the murder of his own children and then use those children's bodies as instruments of his eternal torture. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably wondering why anyone would want to hear this story, why anyone would study it, why it matters in our modern world. These are questions I asked myself repeatedly as I dove deeper into this research. What I discovered changed my entire perspective on mythology, storytelling, and the role that dark narratives play in human culture. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're psychological tools. They're ways for cultures to process trauma, to explore the boundaries of human behavior, and to transmit essential wisdom about the nature of existence. When we sanitize them, when we remove their darkness and their edge, we lose access to that wisdom. We lose the opportunity to confront difficult truths about ourselves and our world. The Punishment of Loki is a story about the price of betrayal, but it's also a story about the nature of justice, the bonds of family, the limits of forgiveness, and the terrible weight of consequences that can never be undone. These are themes that are just as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago, but we can't access their full power if we only encounter sanitized versions of the stories. Over the next 3 parts of this series, I'm going to take you on a journey through this dark mythology that most people never see. In part 2, I'll tell you the complete story of Loki's punishment in all its graphic detail, walking you through exactly what happens and why it's so much more disturbing than anything you've seen in popular adaptations. In part 3, we'll explore how this story compares to other dark Norse myths and examine the specific elements that make it so unsuitable for Disney adaptation. I'll show you the checklist that media companies use when deciding whether source material can be adapted for family audiences, and you'll see exactly why this story fails every single criteria. And in part 4, the finale, I'll share with you the dramatic reenactment script I've developed for this story, complete with staging directions and musical cues that capture its full emotional impact. I'll also reveal what I believe this story teaches us about human nature and why understanding these dark narratives is essential for anyone who wants to truly understand the cultures that created them. But I need to warn you right now, if you're someone who prefers your mythology sanitized and family-friendly, if you want your gods to be heroes and your stories to have happy endings, then this series is not for you. What I'm about to share will be disturbing, it will be graphic, and it will forever change how you think about Norse mythology and the stories we tell ourselves about the past. However, if you're ready to confront the authentic darkness of these ancient stories, if you want to understand what our ancestors really believed and why these tales have survived for over 1,000 years, then you're in for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about mythology. The rabbit hole goes deep, and once you start down this path, there's no going back to the sanitized versions. You'll see Thor, Loki, and the entire Norse pantheon in a completely different light. You'll understand why these stories were told around fires in the dark of winter, and why they still have the power to disturb us today. So the question is, are you ready to learn the truth about the myths that are too dark for Disney? Are you prepared to discover what really happens when gods seek ultimate revenge? Can you handle the authentic darkness that lies at the heart of the stories that shaped an entire civilization? If your answer is yes, then join me in part 2, where I'll reveal the complete, unvarnished truth about Loki's punishment. Trust me, you've never heard anything like this before, and you'll never look at Norse mythology the same way again.